Hello and welcome to episode 54 of Radio Cricket. Yes, that is 54, the same number of people who think that Australia have a realistic chance of regaining the Ashes. I'm Nishant Joshi, and I'm joined by the man who once travelled to Australia to watch the Ashes. They asked him if he could bowl a bit of spin, but he decided he couldn't betray his home country. It is James Marsh.
Yes, hello, Nishant. Yes, they had high hopes that I could be the next Michael Beer, but things didn't work out. But anyway, Nishant, we met this week. Have you recovered?
Yes, James, as many of our listeners probably won't know, we've both been in the Czech Republic for a few years, but this is the first time in 54 podcasts that we've actually met up together, and it was a lovely occasion. We both went to a rock concert to watch the Foals and Queens of the Stone Age, two of my favourite rock bands, and it was quite interesting because I got the impression that quite a lot of our followers didn't quite fancy us as rock music fans. I thought it was quite faintly insulting. I thought the reaction towards the announcement that we were actually going to a rock festival and moshing in the front row. Well, I say moshing in the front row. I think that was mainly me, James, if my memory serves me correctly, which is a bit hazy right now, to be honest. I think I was in the front row rocking out to Queens of the Stone Age, and you might have been hanging back due to old age in your flip-flops, no less.
Yes, indeed I was. But yes, people were somewhat sceptical, Nishant, but I think it was the greatest coming together of cricket and music since Brett Lee teamed up with Kumar Sangakkara to do a Backstreet Boys cover. Anyway, one in the eye for the cynics there. But Nishant, from moshes to ashes, and of course this week, the greatest test rivalry resumes with England and Australia starting their 5-match test series at Trent Bridge. They've been playing test matches since 1877 and have faced off against each other 325 times. Australia have won 133, England have won 102, and 91 tests have ended in draws. Throughout that time, of course, we had the Bodyline series in 32-33 with Harold Larwood peppering the Australian batsmen, including the great Don Bradman, with short balls from around the wicket at the behest of his captain, Douglas Jardine, a man more hated in Australia than full-strength beer. Interestingly, on that tour, Nawab Pataldi, who played for both England and India, made a century on his test debut, but then refused to join the Bodyline field set by Jardine, and his captain rather loftily retorted, "I see His Highness is a conscientious objector." In 1975, we had Jeff Thompson hitting David Bumble Lloyd amidships and actually managing to split his box open, an accident which may also have happened to Ishant Sharma during his puberty, given the way he interviews. And of course, more recently, we've had the Australian period of dominance from 1989 to 2005, when Shane Warne basically did to England what he now does to Elizabeth Hurley. But Andy Flower's men have won the last two series and go into the Ashes as hot favourites. But Nishant, what do you make of this over a century-old rivalry?
Well, yes, James, the Ashes are a great sporting rivalry, and it's one of many rivalries that the English are involved in. Just to name a few, for example, of course we have the English versus Australia, of course we have the English and Americans, we have England and India, England and Ireland, Englishmen versus Scotsmen, and of course, the most famous of them all, Englishmen versus other Englishmen. And of course, James, cricket is a sport sustained by its rich history of rivalries. We have the Ashes, but we also have India versus Pakistan, the Trans-Tasman rivalry of Australia and New Zealand, and the most recent, but of course the biggest one of them all, it is, James, Mumbai Indians versus Chennai Super Kings. And just to give our listeners a bit of background to the history of the Ashes, they're named as such after a satirical obituary was published in a British newspaper called the Sporting Times, and this was back in 1882 after Australia beat England at the Oval, which was the first time that they'd beat England in their own backyard. And this obituary jokingly and, to be honest, rather passive-aggressively stated that English cricket had died and that its body would be cremated and the Ashes taken to Australia, and thus the English media dubbed the next English tour to Australia as the quest to regain the Ashes. So James, it's fair to say that 131 years later, the Ashes series is the ultimate joke that got out of hand, along with, of course, Mitchell Johnson's barber telling him that his new haircut was on trend, organised religion, and Jadeja Geddon. But James, as we entered the 2013 series, the Australians are in disarray in terms of behaviour and all the off-field stuff, along with the on-field poor performances of the last few years after the golden generation abruptly came to an end. So, James, do you think that Australia can recover from their problems to put up a good showing in these Ashes?
Well, I think there's been a lot of hubris, or Ashes bants, as it's now known, from English fans ahead of this series. But I think England fans, such as myself, are right to be confident, but there's perhaps a couple of reasons to be wary. Firstly, Australians' preparations may have been about as convincing as a Chris Martin forward defensive, but they've now played two first-class games in England without anybody assaulting a small child in a nightclub or grassing up one of their teammates. This is a big step forward compared to the last few months, and in all seriousness, just watching the interviews with the players and those of Lehmann himself and his captain Michael Clarke, there does seem to be almost a sense of relief that they can now just focus on cricket rather than reenacting the last days of Rome, where several of the team all seem determined to play the role of Nero. England, for their part, I don't think they are as settled as they could be. I think that Nick Compton has been treated about as well as David Warner treats his liver. I don't understand why he was guesting for Worcestershire against Australia. He made a very smooth and classy 81, but obviously they had no intention of playing him whatsoever, and Joe Root will open the innings, as furiously lobbied for by Michael Vaughan all along. Secondly, England are slower starters than the field of the World Tortoise Sprint Championships. They clung on with Matt Pryor's glorious fingernails in Dunedin earlier this year. They lost the first test in Ahmedabad before that against India. They lost the first test at the Oval against South Africa last summer. They lost the first and second and third tests against Pakistan in the UAE in 2012. But the match that sticks in my mind is the first Ashes test of 2009. Australia had just won away in South Africa, but had previously lost at home in a series which saw the retirement of Matthew Hayden to go along with those of McGrath, Warne and Langer. So England went into that match feeling pretty breezy, but only escaped with a draw due to the last wicket stand between James Anderson and Monty Panesar, which was particularly remarkable because they both had terrible problems with their gloves throughout, which meant they often had to be changed, although cynical Australians, and Ricky Ponting in particular, seemed to think that this was merely time wasting. So, Nishan, I think there are a couple of reasons that England fans shouldn't be too overconfident, but on paper, surely they have to fancy their chances.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I think in almost every department, England are wiping the floor with Australia. And if you look at England's bowling, it is a very ruthless, potent attack when you compare it to Australia's. I mean, man for man, England are just a far stronger side, and they're a far more settled side than Australia as well. The only real question mark over England coming into the series is over whether Bresnan or Finn will play, and you've got to say that Bresnan does look to have the edge in Andy Flower's book right now. He seems to prefer him as more of a bit of a workhorse, a bit more of a reliable entity, as opposed to Finn, who I think is an exceptionally good bowler and has been quite hard done by in terms of recent selection. And from the Australian point of view, I do think that they do have reason to not be entirely pessimistic. I think that Mitchell Starc, a world-class bowler already, and I think that a lot of English fans will be surprised at just how good he already is. I think in the ODI setup he's already done exceptionally well, and I think that's going to translate into tests very well. James Patterson, brilliant start to his test career, and Peter Siddle, our favourite veggie venom, a real pin-up of this podcast, and I think that he's indefatigable. He's a really good bowler, and Australia's bowling reserves are pretty much just about as good as anyone's in the world right now. I mean, if you look at Australia's bench strength, it really is quite fantastic in terms of fast bowlers. It's the spin bowling which does have a bit of a question mark over it. I think that Nathan Lyon has been particularly unappreciated by the Australian selectors. He's been Australia's most successful spinner since Shane Warne, according to statistics in tests, and he's not really got the credit that he's deserved, because over the past few years Australia's pace bowling lineup has been quite inconsistent, and he hasn't really had the sort of opportunities to really stamp his claim on a game that I feel that commentators have been insinuating he should have been taking 5 and 10 wicket hauls every time he plays. So I think that Nathan Lyon is a reliable, if not spectacular, off-spin option for Australia. Of course, they were quite desperate for an alternative to Nathan Lyon. They even fast-tracked Fawad Ahmed's passport so that he could play for Australia in this Ashes series, but after one dud tour game, it looks like he's out of the picture already. So it does look that Australia do have a sense of being unsettled around them, but they're also the type of team who have plenty of talent in their ranks. It's just, to be honest, the main weakness for me, it seems kind of unsolvable at this late stage, is their batting, and in particular their technique against the swinging ball. As I mentioned before, I think England's fast bowling setup is quite exceptional, and in Graham Swann they've really got an excellent spinner against left-handers in particular. So it'll be really interesting to see just how Graham Swann fares against the left-handers. You've got Cowan, Warner, Phil Hughes and Khawaja all vying for a couple of slots as well. Steve Smith in there as well. I think Steve Smith really deserves a spot in the starting 11 for Australia, especially after we saw his true mettle in India as he made 92 in a losing cause earlier this year. I think that against the swinging ball, that's where the Ashes will be won and lost. And even though I'm not entirely sure about Joe Root just at this early stage, I think that in someone like Alistair Cook, Jonathan Trott, number 3, you've got proven test credentials there, and I can't really see England losing these Ashes. Trent Bridge trumpet news now, and James, I know you're probably as devastated as anybody else to hear this week that Trent Bridge banned Billy the Trumpeter. That is Billy the Trumpeter, the very same man who blows his trumpet for every English game around the world. He has been banned from Trent Bridge from the first test from blowing his trumpet throughout the game. So James, what do you make of this tragic news?
Yes, Nishant, Billy the Trumpet, the musical monkey to the Barmy Army's organ grinder, has been banned from Trent Bridge for the first Ashes test. This has caused a huge furore on Twitter, with Cricinfo launching an online poll and someone, presumably only recently released back into the community, setting up an online petition to have the ban overturned. For my part, I'm not too bothered about it, especially because if we're going to ban irritating droning sounds in cricket, this might spell the end of Nick Knight's commentary career. But I must admit, I do quite like Billy the Trumpet's version of Wonderwall, even if other people in the crowd might prefer to have a little oasis of calm while they're watching the cricket. So Nishan, I just wondered what you made of this incident.
Well, yes, James, I suppose that Test cricket will just have to struggle through without a full brass band playing at the ground, as it has occasionally managed to do so over the past 100 or so years. But James, the fact of the matter remains that if I wanted to sit next to something loud and repetitive, I'd just take a seat next to Ravi Shastri. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much for joining us once again. Do make sure you subscribe to us on soundcloud.com/Radio Cricket. We are on iTunes as well if you just search for Radio Cricket. So that's all from me, Nishant Joshi.
And from me, James Marsh. And I leave you with the wise words of former Australian captain Alan Border, who in 1993 said, "I'm not talking to anyone in the British media. They are all pricks." Goodbye.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.